The wonder of being the facilitator is you get to ask the questions first if you have any. So I have a couple of just quick ones. Josh, has any local government in Colorado actually regulated gathering lines to your knowledge?
Well, like I said, Adams County, in their denial, and it was based on their zoning regulations, denied that pipeline. So de facto, they've regulated it, but they don't have specific regulations about, specific to pipelines. But that fell under a siting, a location provision of what their zoning requirements were, and so they were able to deny that pipeline in that location.
Right, and I think that wasn't specifically a gathering line, but it would have applied to gathering lines.
That I don't know. This I would assume it would have, but once again, it probably would depend on the size and the impact that it was going to have, and they felt that impact exceeded what they wanted in that area, what they had zoned for.
Okay, and my second question, and this might fall on PHMSA, if there's anybody from PHMSA in the room that wants to answer. If we go the road where the states have to weigh in and each regulate gathering lines individually, that's a huge burden financially on the states. I don't remember how, the states rely a lot on reimbursement from PHMSA through their grant programs to cover costs. If they weighed into gathering lines, would PHMSA's grants expand to cover those costs of companies that do that, or states that do that? Do you want to answer, or do you?
So this question actually came up earlier today, and it's a valid question. There's a pot of money that Congress gives to us to allocate to the states. Currently, that pot of money goes to the regulation of mostly intrastate natural gas and some intrastate liquid. The trick here, I believe, and I may have to be corrected by our lawyers at another time, is that money goes to regulation of pipelines that PHMSA has regulatory authority over. In other words, the states regulate those lines basically on the Secretary's behalf through a certification agreement. That makes sense. So therefore, the money that Congress gives us goes to regulation of pipe that PHMSA could regulate. My understanding would be that money might not be able to be applied to gathering lines that PHMSA has no authority to regulate. Now, I could be wrong, and we'd have to double check. The other option is that if states were to pursue regulation of gathering lines that PHMSA does not regulate, they may be able to do it through a state function, a user fee, or some other mechanism to obtain those monies for funding.
All right, I saw a hand back here. I think it looks like Rick Trice from the city of Fort Worth.
Yes, sir, thank you. I guess this question is probably directed toward Don since he brought it up. Just to put this a little bit in context, the city of Fort Worth is a city around 800 square miles, excuse me, with a population of 750,000 people with the last census. Since we first amended our ordinance in 2009 to regulate natural gas pipelines, at that time we had about 650 miles of natural gas pipelines in the city. Last time I ran that query, we're over 1,000 now. Don, you went through 192 and some of the requirements for determining class of pipeline. And I'm curious, in a highly urbanized area like Fort Worth, that's consistently one of the fastest growing cities in the nation, cities that size and other cities are no doubt in the same boat. How does industry, or how should industry treat class of pipeline when you know that today it might go in as a class 1, but 10 years from now it might find itself in a class 4? I know 192 requires audits, but when you invest that sort of money into a pipeline, I'm curious, you don't want to go in 10 years later and replace a class 1 with a class 4. So how does industry, or how should industry treat that sort of phenomena in a highly urbanized area?
Well, Rick, probably best way to answer that is in the Fort Worth area, we've used a class 4 design for most of the stuff that we've put in recent years. So we think we've taken care of it in that regard. But we also, in Fort Worth, because it is a populated area, we've gone over and above the code in that we constantly monitor those lines. We fly them. We fly those lines 12 times a year, whether they're regulated or not. Four of those patrols are leak surveys. The other are aerial patrols looking for encroachments and things of that nature. We think we've gone over and above what the code requirements are because we know Fort Worth is a rapidly growing area. We've always wanted to be a good citizen there, so we think we've taken the initiatives there to do things that those lines would be there many years from now.
I do have a follow-up question. It just seems like 192 is kind of a reactive provision or law. Would you agree that industry should be proactive in the way they design and install? If, for example, again, like you said, most installations in Fort Worth were Class 4, shouldn't there be a planning horizon dictated in the code as to how you design and install your pipeline?
I don't feel that I can answer that for industry. Again, I think each time you have to look at it on a case-by-case basis. Fortunately, or unfortunately as the case may be, we haven't encountered any more real populated areas. We thought we were going to get into the city of Shreveport in that regard, so we started off designing there for Class 3. In Pennsylvania, we're mostly in rural areas. We're not in, but we still go over and above what 192 requires in most of our design up there. I think you have to look at it on a company-by-company basis. They have to decide what's best for them. But it's certainly something that PHMSA could be looking at and going forward if they adopt a risk-based approach to get any type of gathering line regulation.
I have a two-part question. Josh, have you talked to the Public Utilities Commission in Colorado at all? And the reason I ask that is that they have substantial gathering line regulations in addition to the Oil and Gas Commission, and they do exceed what PHMSA standards are. And so just, you don't necessarily have to answer right now, but if you have not looked at that, I would encourage you to do that. I think they have a lot more on the books than you maybe have highlighted here today.
Yeah, well, the conversations that I had with them, I was told pretty much that they don't, and that what they deal with specifically is what I guess I would call the commercial lines, commercial delivery, retail lines. They said that they did not deal with gathering lines that were specific to production systems, but theirs were specific to retail delivery, commercial delivery, and that was what I was told. Now, I'm here to get educated too. So if you can show that to me, I'd like to learn.
I will be happy to share that with you after this
You
conference. Don, can you share with us a little bit about the states and the activities that they've taken in terms of what's been going on proactively in the shale, and that we are, from an industry perspective, talking about a lot of these issues? Sure.
I mentioned already Ohio and what they've done as far as make Class 1 gathering associated with hydraulic fracturing or shale plays, make that regulated. Texas has a proposal, a bill that's been signed. They're going to be looking at Class 1 gathering with the possibility of moving that forward. Linda mentioned the possibility of state assessments. Pennsylvania is now assessing gathering companies $633 a mile for regulated lines in that state to help fund their program. There's a lot of things going on that, probably behind the scenes. We're working very closely with the states on some of these activities.
And as a follow-up to that, can you clarify whether it has been an intentional act to exempt some gathering lines from regulatory requirements versus not having PHMSA actually have jurisdiction over them?
I'm not sure I understand the question there.
Well, okay, in 192, all gathering lines are subjected to 192, correct?
That's correct.
But PHMSA has taken specific actions to exempt certain requirements based on risk.
Based on class location, right, or risk.
And so, in theory, PHMSA really does have jurisdiction over all these lines, do they not?
Linda could probably answer that better than me, since she's more current, but that's the way I would understand it, yes.
Good. That was one of my questions because I thought I heard the NAPSR say they were regulated, and I thought Linda said they weren't.
So, what a sticky question. You know, I knew I should have gone to that other over there.
Told you to, Linda.
So I will speak again from my understanding, with understanding my lawyers may get me when I get back home. But it's just being recorded. Thank you for that comfort. So the way it works is the statute gives the Secretary of Transportation broad authority over certain areas. However, the statute specifically excludes certain things. For example, we can't touch production lines. We can't. There are some exclusions in the regulation. I'm talking about both liquid and gas, but there are certain things that we can't get to through regulation. We do have broader authority than we currently exert. And so amongst the umbrella of things that we can regulate, there is significant room for expansion, which I don't believe I'm giving anything away by saying that we would be pursuing that. You know, we do believe more regulation is needed. So I don't know if that was the answer you wanted or needed, but that would be my best answer.
I have a question. Ma'am, who are you with?
Oh, I'm an independent consultant. I will put on the table that I was heavily involved in the regulation of gathering over the last 10 years, including the rulemaking that happened in 2006.
I'm sorry, in the rulemaking that did what?
The PHMSA rulemaking that was adopted in 2006.
Okay, and I'm sorry, you're a consultant?
Yeah, I'm a consultant. My name is Lindsay Sander.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Oh, boy, we've got questions on this. I'll come back.
Lois Epstein, Vice President of the Trust Board. I just actually have a couple of comments. I'll be brief. I wanted folks to count me among the increasing numbers of people that do lose some sleep over this issue, and not just for gas gathering lines, but also for oil gathering lines, which are growing in number as well. There are lots of existing problems. I want to note that the state of Alaska has completely eliminated the term gathering lines in its regulations because they knew of all the confusions in terms of, specifically I'm talking about oil, but many of the problems that have been brought up about defining gathering lines exist for oil as well as for gas. In terms of risk-based rulemaking, one thing I thought a lot about, having worked on this issue for probably over a decade now, is that PHMSA and its predecessor agencies always focused on the worst problems. Well, initially, when you develop a framework, transmission lines was where they really put their emphasis. Well, now that there is a framework for transmission lines, I would argue they need to look and reassess and figure out where their biggest risks lie. And the biggest risks may be not in transmission lines and maybe for something like gathering lines, because they are now either unregulated or underregulated. And that's my last point, that I think that just because some states on a map have done something, that may not be sufficient. And that's the broader picture there. So thanks. Great session.
Hi, I'm from Pennsylvania, and I want to thank all of you. I've learned already so much in just this half day. I'm working under contract with our state DEP on source water protection efforts with public water systems. And a question that I have is that we are in the process of developing source water protection plans for public water systems across the state, and our contractor has told me that when part of what they incorporate into the protection plans is identification of particular threats that are out there. When I inquired as to whether they were able to incorporate pipelines into that matrix, that threat matrix, they told me that they were unable to secure that data, that they were prevented from being able to incorporate that, and that seems to me to be something that would be within the purview that a public water system would need to know where those lines are, simply from a standpoint of maintenance of their own infrastructure, that is their staff and their contractors whose lives would be at risk when they are in fact trying to deal with a water main break or something in the proximity of a pipeline. So I'm hopeful if someone can educate me about whether these pipeline locations are considered sensitive data from a homeland security standpoint, or why we would be prohibited from learning the location of those lines. That's my one question. And my other question is there any reporting regime currently for pipeline operators to report where they are installing these lines?
Wow. Well, if you're in Washington State, you wouldn't have any problem getting that information.
We know where all our gathering lines are.
Yeah.
Do you want to say more?
No, go ahead.
My experience in La Plata County was that when we asked pipeline companies to do that, we had significant pushback for that reason that you mentioned, Homeland Security. And the compromise that was reached was that they would give that information to our Office of Emergency Management, but it was considered proprietary or confidential or however, whatever the term was, to fulfill that requirement in terms of Homeland Security, in terms of, minimizing any risk of sabotage and that sort of thing. So we, at least in the county, we have that information. Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm just telling you that's why we dealt with it down there. So we did get that information, but it's not. I mean, you can't go online and see it.
So a water system in your area would go to their Office of Emergency Management?
I might be able to help on this a little bit, at least for Pennsylvania. And it's my understanding, and I'm going to look to Emily because she will correct me, is part of the problem getting that data is no one is collecting that information. There's no requirement that you have to provide that mapping information to most states. I think Pennsylvania just passed a law where they're starting to require that information. I'm trying to get a head nod here. Just a registry where new pipelines, and Don probably knows about this too, need to start producing that information and give it to the states. But I'm suspecting that the problem for you getting it in Pennsylvania is it doesn't exist. More so than Homeland Security. We've been through that Homeland Security thing with all kinds of other pipelines, and PHMSA weighed in, and we have a national pipeline mapping system now too. And I remember, wasn't there a congressional mandate that asked you to start thinking about adding gathering lines to the NPMS? Just wishful thinking on my part. Okay. So I think that may be more the answer than Homeland Security, that they just don't have the information to give you. But they're working on it, at least in Pennsylvania. I can't talk about other states.
There is some information available that is given by the industry to counties, but it's not consistent.
Right.
Not every operator is given.
So it's kind of voluntary at this point. All right. We had a question back here.
I do want to make a slight clarification. There is slight clarification. Although there isn't a congressional mandate to look at adding gathering lines to NPMS, there were two provisions that Congress said that there's no mandate, but you may ask for information about gathering lines, but it didn't link it to the NPMS. So one of the big challenges that we have as far as rulemaking is we don't know what's out there. So we don't get reports on incidents. You heard Cynthia talk this morning about, that whole cost benefit. In order to show that there's a risk, we have no idea if there's a risk because we don't get incident information. So it's a horse and cart issue.
I'm John Jacoby. I'm a former CATS person out of the Southwest region. We did a study in the Southwest region a couple of years ago and spent a lot of time and a lot of effort trying to figure out how many of these lines might be regulated. And it is extremely difficult to try and identify potentially newly regulated lines because these people are not involved in the regulatory scheme. They don't have a clue that they're supposed to report these things, even if they do become jurisdictional. And there's just no way to develop all of that information. So it's a huge communication problem to try and get these people to come out because, as mentioned earlier, PHMSA only has 200 people in the whole agency, and it takes a lot of time and a lot of effort to try and develop these things and create that information. And it's not for lack of effort. I mean, they are genuinely trying to come up with this kind of information, and it's just not there.
Okay, someone's been waiting patiently back here. I think I forgot my question. Well, that worked pretty well. So there's one behind you here.
Hi. So in Pennsylvania, the legislation that Carl was referring to is Act 127, and Act 127 gives the PAPUC the authority to require that operators register all but Class 1 gathering lines with the PAPUC. There's a little bit of understanding that if you know where a wellhead is and you know where everything but the Class 1s are, that you probably can connect the dots to where the Class 1s are, but the Class 1s are still unregulated. That's been a problem in Pennsylvania because we're a commonwealth, and as a commonwealth, municipalities have the local zoning authority. Act 13 in Pennsylvania has attempted to override that local authority, and that's in the courts at this point in time. But I will say that the PAPUC, who is absolutely overworked, and particularly now with Marcelo Shale coming into the state, the chief of gas safety there has been working with PHMSA and with One Call, and one of their concepts to resolve this problem is to have all lines regulated, period. Whether it's a gas, hazardous water, sewer, have all lines regulated. And I know that's very controversial, but that is one of the concepts that it's being tossed around in Pennsylvania.
All right. Other questions? Let me get the microphone to you so the people on the webcast will know what's going on.
I want to take advantage of having these wonderful experts here. So if I am in a rural area and I'm the chairman of my local water authority, small rural area, I want to prevent my guys. We still have wooden logs carrying water in some areas of Pennsylvania. They're over 100 years old. We have water main break. We want to be safe. We don't want anybody to have an incident and jeopardize their safety and security. How can I assure my people that I'm not going to unintentionally encounter a gathering line? What would you suggest that we should do? Or what processes could we build into our best practices so that in the absence of having this framework where we can check something online, what can we do?
Well, you know, one thing you said is if you're going to be disturbing the soil, then have all these lines in one call so that your one call would know where these are and it would notify the operator to do that. The other thing is know who is in your county and work with them. We would share, to answer the previous question, you know, if they would call us, we would work with them. We wouldn't necessarily give them our maps because we can't guarantee the accuracy of those maps or how they're going to be used. But we would certainly go out there and work on them with them individually to help them establish where that pipeline was if they have questions. And that's why the local emergency council is a good resource, as well as just knowing that we are your neighbors, we're in the county with you. If you contact us, we'll work with you to show you where those lines are.
So Don, in Pennsylvania, are rural gathering lines required to be a member of the One Call?
I don't know if they are, Carl. I will say our lines are in One Call, and I believe my counterparts said their lines are in One Call too.
Okay, so there may be some that might be missing, but majority of operators are voluntarily doing that.
Yes. Why would you not? Yeah.
One Call is not mandated in Pennsylvania right now for gathering lines, and we have a bill pending in both the House and the Senate that will bring unconventional lines into One Call, but not conventional.
Okay, any last questions? We've got, we're out of time, so I'm glad there's no last questions. Oh, you finally remembered?
No.
No.
You feel like
Why not conventional lines? I don't think we know the answer.